Hello and welcome to this CG Cookie tutorial. My name is Kent Trammell, and in this series I'm going to walk you through the styling and rendering of long human hair with Blender and Cycles. As most of you probably know by now, strand rendering is a newly added feature of the Cycles rendering engine, and even at its young age the feature can produce strikingly believable results. If you have any experience with the older Blender internal strand rendering capabilities, well, let's say you're in for a treat. Now understand that the strand editing is still the same because it's a separate feature, but the rendering process is much better with Cycles. But a lot of the time I still do default to Blender internal, especially when global illumination and reflections aren't important, simply because it will deliver a much cleaner image out of the box significantly faster than Cycles will. And likewise, internal strand rendering can be faster, emphasis on can, but it's dependent on very inaccurate and I think clumsy shadow maps. And also it approximates strand geometry with flat planes instead of cylinders. Due to both of these realities, a believable result requires an exhausting amount of effort. And again, if you've had experience in the past with this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But now with Cycles, hair shading and rendering is remarkably simple, and this is because shadowing is done correctly with global illumination, and each strand can be rendered with the appropriate cylindrical shape. Shading and rendering is, however, only half the battle, and now thanks to Cycles, it's certainly the easier half. Strand editing and styling is where the war of believable hair is won or lost, and this is where we will be spending the majority of our time. Now, before we actually get to work, I'm going to jump into Blender so we can educate ourselves about scalp anatomy. This is going to be the geometry we'll be using for the duration of this tutorial series, and it's really just intended to be a mannequin of sorts because we will become hairstylists, just focusing on the hair. We will only touch this geometry when we extract a piece for the scalp, and I'll be talking about that later. But I wanted to jump in here and go over some scalp anatomy. If I jump to texture paint mode, I have a very simple texture painted that is outlining parts of the scalp. Now, anatomy for this isn't extremely important by any means, but it will serve as a reference point. So instead of me saying grow this guide hair out of this section of the head and point with my mouse, I'll be able to add further clarification by saying grow this guide hair out of the base of the crown, and you should know exactly what I'm talking about. So this green portion highlighted up here is the area directly behind the forehead, and it's just called the top. Pretty scientific, I know. Below that, this yellow region is called the parietal ridge. Now you probably won't hear me talk about that too much because it's a very small area, and typically I'll just say the side or the temple, which is this area painted in red. Towards the back of the head we have this pretty large section in blue, and this is the crown. This is where we'll have a lot of our hairs originate, and you'll see the hairs start to grow out from the crown. And the last area below that is the nape. And that's really all for the scalp vocabulary that I'll be using throughout this tutorial series. Again, it's really not crucial to know these things, but it does put us on the same page when you hear me throwing out names like nape and temple and crown. And also it just makes us sound like we know a little bit more what we're talking about. So now that we know that, we're ready to look at some photographs, make some observations that will send us on a good path to achieving this hairstyle that we want. These 4 images represent the hairstyle I'm aiming for. It's kind of a wavy layered do with a little bit of curling. The reason for this style is that it's fairly difficult to achieve. For one, it's long, meaning a little past the shoulders, and 2, the curls, which must be shaped by hand. There's no procedural way to achieve this look. So in theory, if we can accomplish this difficult hairstyle, then we can accomplish any of them. Now, let's examine closer the behavior of the strands, or locks. And I say locks because you can see that the hairs tend to congregate together into groups of many hairs. And you can see this happening all over the head. In fact, the majority of the hairstyle is defined by these locks. And this is great because Blender's hair system is manageable due to the concept of children. And children hairs are strands that obey the behavior of the parent or guide hair. So when we edit hair, it's of course ridiculous to think of editing each individual strand, so instead we manipulate only a manageable number of guide hairs. Then the children, in effect, will populate the large quantities of strands necessary for a realistic head of hair. Another observation is the layering of this hairdo. I like to break down the hairstyle into 3 categories. Number 1 is the main layer, number 2 is the key locks layer, and number 3 is the frizz layer. These are of course my own labels, if you can't tell. The main layer provides the vast majority of the hairstyle in volume. Most of our styling time is spent here. The key locks layer is an accent layer that helps to A, reinforce the style, and B, introduce some chaos and diversity to break up some of the procedural look to CG hair. The frizz layer is the most subtle of the 3 layers. You can see it best in this photo, where the rebellious children have broken ranks and make this sort of outer glow of rogue strands that catch the light. This touch really anchors the digital hairdo into reality. The second observation I want to make before jumping into Blender is the flow of the hair. The last thing to take away from these photos is the general flow and direction that these strands are going. Since our hair isn't set up in a ponytail or pinned in any way, the flow of the hairstyle is mostly southward thanks to gravity. But we do have the option of artistic freedom here. If this character were to be rigged and animated, I might suggest to keep the hairstyle as symmetrical as possible. But this character isn't going to be rigged, it's strictly an exercise in static hairstyling. And since symmetry is less interesting and believable, we have the option of introducing asymmetry. I'm going to do this by pulling the hair behind the ear on one side and leaving it to fall over the front of the shoulder on the other side. That's it for observation, things that I want to think about before I jump in. And so at this point, I'm feeling pretty good about my goal, and I want to briefly outline my approach for achieving it. Number 1, as you can imagine, I'm going to start with the main layer, which will require, again, about 75% of the styling phase. I'll start by populating the southern hemisphere of the scalp, then I'll jump all the way to the top and finish populating from the part. If you have any experience with hair in Blender, you know that the viewport representation can look very different when rendered. So we'll also need to test the style with preview rendering, which means we'll make a temporary material at this stage as well. Next, I'll add the key locks and frizz layers, which take less time and are sort of the icing on the cake for the hairstyle. Finally, I'll finesse the shader and set up the final render. That is all for this introductory video. I will see you in part 2.